It's May the 11th, 2022, and welcome to Leaders on the Frontier. My name is David Leeson. I'm your host today. The Frontier Center for Public Policy is about better public policy for a better tomorrow. Our topic today, investigating the management of COVID-19. There's no doubt that the arrival of the COVID-19 virus will be remembered for many years to come. Not necessarily for the virus itself per se, but rather for how the government of Canada and our provincial governments managed it. Everyone would agree that the decisions made or not made had a profound and often devastating impact on the lives of every Canadian, our economy, our health, and our very civic society. A number of Canadians even rose up in a form of a freedom protest, which continues to this day. And therefore, the question is, how do we learn from this moment in Canadian history? Should there be an inquiry into this matter? What might it look like? We want to explore this question with our guest and friend of Frontier, the Honorable Preston Manning. He is the author of the recent fictional account published by the Frontier Center called The Report of the COVID Commission, dated June 5, 2023. And you can find that on our website today. Born in 1942, the Honorable Preston Manning is the second son of the longtime Alberta Premier Ernest C. Manning. Growing up in a household which was both political and evangelical, he became intimately familiar with the political and religious experience of Western Canada. Mr. Manning served as a member of Parliament from 1993 to 2001. He founded two political parties, the Reform Party of Canada and the Canadian Reformed Conservative Alliance, both of which became the official opposition in the Canadian Parliament. He laid the foundation then for the Conservative Party of Canada to this day. In 2006, the CPC formed a minority federal government under Stephen Harper, originally elected as a reformer and later a majority government. Mr. Manning served as leader of the opposition from 1997 to the year 2000 and was also his party's science and technology critic. In 2007, he was made a companion of the Order of Canada. In 2013, was appointed to the Privy Council. After leaving Parliament in 2001, Mr. Manning founded two non-for-profit organizations, the Manning Foundation for Democratic Education and the Manning Center for Building Democracy. He continues to be very active in research, education, and writing, and is the author of 4 books: The New Canada, Think Big, Faith, Leadership, and Public Life, and most recently, Do Something, 365 Ways That You Can Strengthen Canada. Welcome, Mr. Manning.
Well, thank you very much, David.
Well, it's a delight to see you, and I know that I can't believe that you're retired. I don't see any evidence of that, Preston. You seem to be very much a whirlwind of activity.
Yeah.
Well, today we've got a lot to talk about. In fact, we'll probably be a bit of an extended version or discussion. And it's a fascinating discussion, I think. And I want to set the stage a little bit. I thoroughly enjoyed reading your fictional account of the report of the COVID Commission. It's dated June 5, 2023. And I found it very intriguing as you kind of used your creative writing and imagination to invite us into a world where there will be a COVID-19 commission. Why did you write this fictional story, and what were your key objectives?
Well, I wanted to help Canadians imagine, use our political imagination, and first of all, imagine what if an official COVID commission actually was set up to investigate the management of the COVID pandemic? What might it uncover that people don't know? What questions might it answer? I've collected about 15 or 16 questions from some pretty thoughtful people that the government has really not answered. What might it report? What might its recommendations be? What lessons might it learn? I wanted to imagine that and help other people imagine it. And then the second thing I wanted to imagine, what if the desire for greater freedom from all these restrictions that was represented by the Freedom Convoy, the independent truckers, what if that morphed into a broader freedom movement, if you will? And what would be the consequences of that? What would be the consequences of that politically, particularly in the next year or so? So those were basically the two objectives, and trying to get people to imagine those two streams of thought. What if there was a commission? What if the desire for freedom morphed into something broader than the truckers?
So you're really looking at those larger questions. And it's very interesting. I should just note on a personal context that, and I know that you alluded to this in the preface, but you and your wife are actually in a vulnerable group. It's hard to believe you're 80 years of age, but you had COVID. How did you recover?
Well, yeah, I come from a family, but both I had a grandmother and my father both suffered from tuberculosis. Both had TB back in an era when that was a pretty serious thing. So I think we got bad lungs, and I get pneumonia quite regularly. And so because of my age and because of that, I'm in a fairly vulnerable group. And so we did all the things that government told us to do. Were vaccinated twice and had the booster shot. We social distance. We wore the masks. And
Wow.
did all the things you're supposed to do. And then in the end of the day, we got the Omicron version of it. But we tried to comply with all the regulations, and partly because of being that vulnerable.
Now, you and your family have a considerable history of service in government, serving our country. So, with that kind of long experience and perspective, you've been through a lot of things. How do you summarize COVID-19, this pandemic, as a historic event? Is there a comparison? Is there a
Well,
sense of
yeah,
how profoundly this impacted our nation?
I think it's pretty unique in the sense of three major factors, any one of which would be a national calamity. First of all, there was the whole health aspect of it. You have a national pandemic that affected millions and millions of people. And secondly, you had these health protection measures that limited, and some people would say violated, the constitutionally guaranteed rights and freedoms under the Charter of millions of people. And then thirdly, you had this unprecedented lockdown of the economy. And you had all three of these happen together: a national pandemic, a national limitation of rights and freedoms supposedly guaranteed by the Charter, and a lockdown of the economy, all happening at once. I find it hard to find any historical precedent for that.
So, given that kind of historic, unprecedented nature of this challenge, this continues to impact our nation, will continue to do so, I'm sure, for really arguably a couple generations. So the purpose of this kind of inquiry isn't some kind of shallow partisan exercise. It's truly a profound opportunity to learn. Is that it?
I think so. And I do think you don't want to be overcritical of people in tense situations, but I do believe this thing has been mismanaged.
Hmm.
And my focus has been more on the federal government, because that's been my background. And so I think there's some profound lessons to be learned from this, on if we ever get into any situation similar to this again, how not to do what some of the things that we did.
Okay.
Yeah, yeah.
And you're not suggesting that it's only the federal government. Obviously, the provinces in many ways also were obviously major partners, among others, and municipal governments. So many other organizations had a role to play in the management of COVID-19.
Yeah, I think a number of them took their lead from the federal government. And one of the main things the federal people did, and I get into this in this COVID report, and I think this would come out if you had a full-blown commission. The federal government seemed to automatically turn the management of this thing over to the healthcare bureaucracy, to the great big health department. And instead of turning it over to emergency measures type organizations, which have been set up in the provinces, and the federal government had one. Originally, the Public Health Agency for Canada was set up in a response to the SARS pandemic. SARS wasn't as big a pandemic as this, but it was a health crisis, and that agency was set up. But that agency ended up turning into a bureaucratic one, managing the bureaucracy, appointed a bureaucrat to head it. And so I think the biggest single decision at the front end, the federal government made, we're going to hand this over to the bureaucracy rather than to these more nimble, smaller emergency measure organizations that are set up to handle it. And some of the provinces, I know at least one of the maritime provinces, when you ask them, why did you do the same thing? Why did you turn it over to your healthcare bureaucracy? Said, well, the feds did it, and we assumed that's the model, and we also assumed that if we followed their model, if there's going to be any money to help pay for this, the closer we follow their model, the more likely are to qualify for that kind of funding. So
there's that kind of pattern established by the federal government,
and very early.
Yeah.
I think that was one of the major decisions that was made, and I don't think it was the right decision.
Now, I want to shift a little bit to the story that you wrote, and just a reminder to people in the discussion here. It's interesting how you wrote this document as really fiction, but it really isn't as you imagine what an inquiry would look like, and the forces that came together to generate this kind of inquiry in Canada. So can you tell us a little bit about your description of the societal forces that really lead to that almost the inevitable inquiry that needs to happen?
Yes, well, I see, and this isn't imagination, I see large numbers of groups expressing concern about this, and they're not going away. There's various groups that are expressing concern about particularly the infringement of rights and freedoms that were done under the health protection measures, and particularly employers, employee groups, labor unions, businesses, and that we're still wrestling with the impacts of locking down your economy. And so I imagine this book that these groups don't go away, although the government would desperately wish them to go away. They don't go away. They get bigger and stronger, and they have meetings, and they say, how can we get a full-blown inquiry into how this thing was done, and what the lessons to be learned from it. And so I sort of see that building up, these groups. I probably shouldn't start mentioning the groups, but I know one that I've been close to is this Canadian COVID Care Alliance. And they have meetings, and they are worrying. It's got a lot of medical and science people in it who are worried about how this thing was handled and don't think it was handled right. There's this Take Back Our Freedoms group that Brian Peckford, the former First Minister from Newfoundland, has been with. There's a number of these groups, and I just assume in this fiction that these groups keep insisting there's got to be an investigation of this. It gets bigger and bigger until finally something's done along that line.
Exactly. So there are these forces that will not go away, and inevitably, you describe in the story how it unfolds, how there's a, quote, non-governmental commission. What do you mean by that term?
Well, in the discussions I've had on this, people say we want an independent commission. We want an independent commission. But then some people say, well, maybe it should be a royal commission. We have these royal commissions. But the trouble with that, to get a royal commission, a government has to appoint it. And which government is going to appoint a commission
and an associated $100 million budget or something like that?
Well, that's the other. These royal commissions take forever to get started, and they go on forever, and they're expensive. But I think the main suspicion would be a royal commission set up by any government would either be a whitewash commission, just to say it's not our fault, or it would be one to shift the blame to somebody else. If it was a provincial one, they say it's the Fed's fault. If it was a federal one, they say it's the provincial fault. So then we get thinking, well, is there such a thing as a non-governmental commission? Could you find commissioners who were independent of government and who had enough credibility and prestige that the public would attach credibility to their investigation? And that's kind of where that discussion is at. But that would be the kind of commission that would, I think, could do the right job on.
So in other words, more of a bottom-up approach.
The challenge for your viewers or listeners is to answer this question: who out there is there anybody that would come to your mind that would be a credible non-governmental commissioner, somebody with enough respect, that people would pay attention to what they're saying and doing, and yet not connected or influenceable by a government or by a drug company or anything else.
Exactly. Yeah.
Not an easy question to answer. So far, I'm not getting many suggestions.
So that's a question that you posed today: is
Yeah.
who would that likely be? Who would those leaders be? Now, it's fascinating in your document here. You reference a number of points of history, and specifically the whole context or history of populist movements in Canada and also internationally. And specifically, you reference the Solidarity movement years ago in Poland and its similarities with the Freedom Truckers. What do you think there's such an eerie resemblance in your mind?
Well, first on your populism point, I've been like Western Canada has had more experience with populist movements, populist parties, and actually populist governments than any other area of North America. So if anybody ought to understand
Oh,
populism, it's wild and woolly side, but also its positive side. And the reason I got into that is because some of the Ottawa crowd said, well, these truckers, this is just another one of these populist, bottom-up, wild and woolly things. Well, my understanding is populism's made some pretty positive contributions. The first women that got elected to the federal parliament and the provincial legislatures all came up through populist movements. Medicare came through a grassroots, bottom-up populist party in Saskatchewan. So, but I go from the populism to this, as you say, eerie resemblance between the Solidarity movement in Poland. It started with a strike. It started with a strike at the Lenin shipbuilding yard in Gdansk.
that's
And
right.
these labor guys just protested the arbitrary measures imposed by, at that time, the communist government of Poland. And they struck. And they started to get some publicity. And a fella, he was just a worker there, Lech Walesa, became a spokesperson. Nobody
That's
had
right.
ever heard of the
And the
guy.
media was not on his side either.
No, no, but he became the spokesperson. Well, X years later, the guy's president of Poland. So these things can turn into something substantive. And so it started with a strike, and it was a populist kind of thing, but it morphed into something bigger. It was then joined by other people who were worried about other freedoms. Poland was a very much Catholic country. Pope John Paul II was Polish, and so the infringement on religious freedom that the government was doing morphed into that. And then there was a group called the Orange Group, who were sort of
Yes.
eccentric guys that they just ridiculed the government. They used a sense of humor, and you had this combination of populist uprising from a strike joined by other people whose liberties were infringed upon, and they actually ended up changing the government. And I suggested that, who knows where this, if this is another one of those populist movements built around affirming rights and freedoms, who knows where that can go, or what spokespersons and leaders might come up that we would never have thought of before.
So part of the lesson of history here is that we have to pay attention to these kinds of movements. Is that what you're saying?
Oh yes, and I had a teacher once. I went to a rural high school, Horse Hill High School, outside of Edmonton. I was playing football. And this teacher, he was a kind of an eccentric guy himself, but I remember him. Ironically, I remember him 60, 70 years later. And he stops me on the playground. He says, "What does it mean to be intelligent?" And I'm a kid. He's being smart. He says, "Intelligence is the ability to recognize that which is significant.
Mm,
And political intelligence is the ability to recognize what's significant." And when you see large numbers of ordinary people who don't read the Charter of Rights and Freedoms every night before they go to bed, starting to talk about that subject, and not just talk about it, to
right.
do something about it,
Yeah.
that is politically, and I don't care what your politics are, that is politically significant in a democratic society. And so you watch it and pay attention to it. And I think this Freedom Convoy, yes, there was some wild and woolly parts to it, but I think at heart it was an honest endeavor by ordinary people to express themselves politically, and we should pay attention to it.
Yeah. I think you make a very good point. Now, it's interesting in your story, Preston, you introduce a strong, charismatic leader named Leah Wahlstrom. She plays a pivotal role. Can you introduce us to Leah Wahlstrom and the role that she plays in your
Well,
story?
I sort of playing off the solidarity thing as well, that out of that movement came somebody that nobody had ever heard of before, became a spokesperson for it, and became a very prominent spokesperson for the movement. So I just imagine, suppose the same thing happened now. And I called her Leah Wahlstrom. Her father's trucking outfit went down because he couldn't survive the lockdown, and she gets madder than the boiled owl about this and joins this Freedom Convoy and starts getting, she's articulate, understands the issue, and starts getting a profile. And it is likely something like that could happen. Well, one of the disturbing things about the way the government has handled this is that they arrested a bunch of these people, the executive of the Freedom Convoy, and jailed them for a while, and then let them out on bail. But these bail conditions that they're subject to are absolutely restrict their freedom of speech, their freedom of expression, their freedom of assembly. They're not supposed to talk to anybody. They're not supposed to.
That's quite astounding, isn't it?
Well, yeah, it is, and it starts to look more like Poland
Right.
in the days of the regime there than it does like the Canada that we know.
So in your story, how did the inquiry finally happen? And how did you define this tipping point where suddenly there was that momentum, that energy that could be translated from that populist movement into formal action?
Well, there was two things. There was more and more of these groups formed, freedom groups, whatever they called their names, that protesting the way that the rights and freedoms guaranteed by the charter were violated by the health protection measures. There gets to be more and more of them. They call the talk shows, they write the newspapers, they do the blogging, the Facebook thing, and there's just a huge furor. It got to be a commission. So they got enough pressure that something had to be done. And then the second thing, and here I'm taking my sort of literary license and doing fiction, they found these commissioners. They found some commissioners that people would attach credibility to. And I identify the areas where I think you could get these commissioners. There's got to be some medical and science. A couple of them have to have that background because this is a scientific medical problem. A couple of them are civil libertarian lawyers who've got a record for understanding the charter and defending people when their rights are violated. There's a few small business people who just wiped out by the lockdown measures, and some private sector union people who, and there's some people with a faith background because of the way that churches were treated. I can sort of identify the pools where you might get these commissioners, and eventually in my story they do find these commissioners. Now, and then when the commission thing starts out in my story, of course the mass media pay no attention to it. They say this is just a bunch of crackpots.
Interesting, yeah.
It goes away. But civil servants that knew the inside story on this started to actually come to this commission to credit and start showing some of the things that went on inside. And all of a sudden, this thing starts getting credibility. People are starting to hear stories that they never heard on the CBC, and from very credible people. And so for a while, it almost went under because nobody said it's credible enough. But because these insiders with inside information start telling their stories, it gets its credibility, and that's how it gets some.
And it's fascinating because so many of these elements facts keep coming to the surface that we did not know of. And yet they've happened. Now, you envision in the story a report. And as I recall, you envisioned some 75 recommendations. It's hard to believe it would be so few.
Yeah.
But it's very interesting how you tell that story. And you're really essentially challenging us as Canadians by telling the story that an inquiry should happen. Is that right?
Well, and I got them into trying to get answers to some of these questions. I've been collecting questions from some pretty knowledgeable people about if you could ask one question about how this thing was managed, what would you ask? It's amazing that none of these questions get asked by the press gallery in Ottawa. There's supposed to be some investigative reporters there. But I've got this list of 16 questions, and I see this commission actually trying to answer these and getting people to that are knowledgeable enough to testify under oath that this is true what they're saying. Like one of the first ones was, why was the management handed over to Health Canada, a bureaucratic organization, instead of the more nimble emergency measures organizations? Why was the principle of triaging, which is what these emergency measures, outfits that are set up to handle emergencies do triaging. They say, who is getting hurt the most right away, and
Right.
they focus their resources on that. They don't try to save the entire population or guarantee its safety. They triage, and this is one of the questions: how come triaging wasn't the
Yeah.
people that
So
were
so in that context, Preston, um, we always knew that there was a more vulnerable population, so that should have been the
yeah,
priority
yeah.
to protect the vulnerable, and
The
that was in the emergency plan. There, I think maybe people don't realize this is that every province and certainly the federal government had a pandemic plan. It wasn't just simply for forest fires; it was for a
Yeah.
pandemic plan, right?
Yeah, well, all of that, and then they get questions into. I've got a big long list here. I've got to read off you, but were no impact assessments done. Like if you're instituting a health protection measure that's going to have an impact on circumscribing the rights and freedoms of Canadians, would you not do an impact assessment of what's the impact? If this ever got to the Supreme Court, what has been done, and it may yet, the Supreme Court has a test called the Oakes test, that if you
Yes.
as a government violate your rights, you got to prove that the benefits from violating the rights or limiting the rights, they would use the word limiting, the benefits from limiting the rights outweigh the negative impacts. But you can't meet the Oakes test without measuring or trying to measure the negative impacts. And that was not done in this case. It
No,
was
it's
not.
fascinating.
Well, it wasn't done with respect to the limiting of rights and freedoms, but nor was it done with respect to the economy. Did anybody ask the question, if you shut down the economy, what's the total negative impacts on
Or the
income?
education of children as we would close down
Well,
schools.
that's a huge one. In the end of the day, that one may be the most long-term damage may have occurred in that area. And so I have this commission looking into this and getting people testifying under oath as to what some of these impacts were.
Well, I'd like to kind of shift away from the story to, and you've got those marvelous 16 questions, and it's important that people look at them. But I think answering those questions and so many others really kind of underline the importance of doing this kind of thoughtful inquiry. If we're going to learn out of this tragedy and frankly build a better country, surely we should be thinking and reflecting on these questions. And I'm just fascinated by the question that you raise about the role of the bureaucracy, um, especially the medical bureaucracy. In fact, it's interesting. Last night, I read in the Blacklock's Reporter, based in Ottawa, they do a fantastic job that $1.5 million of bonuses went out from Health Canada to senior bureaucrats, despite the fact that there was an audit done documenting how Health Canada was ill prepared and mismanaged COVID-19. There was no firings, but rather they sent out bonuses. So what's going on here? You've been in Ottawa a long time. Is there this extraordinary bubble that people are never held accountable within a bureaucratic system where an audit says you were not prepared?
Well, one of the troubles with bureaucracy is it spreads responsibility for any outcome so thinly. It can spread it vertically. Like you take the Indian Affairs Department, from the person working on the reserve to the minister. There's 8 layers of directors and subdirectors and assistant directors and program managers in between. So if something goes wrong in that chain, to find out exactly who it was is hard to do. And then it's divided horizontally. You're into all these departments. And so when you organize things bureaucratic like that, it becomes extremely hard to to identify who is accountable if something goes wrong. If something goes right, the politicians take credit for it. If it goes wrong, they blame the bureaucracy.
Yeah.
But
So then no one is
find out
accountable.
who it is, yeah. And one of the areas where I think and I think this is going to cause trouble for the NDP. It could even blow apart the federal NDP Liberal coalition. These private sector workers, and many of them private sector union workers,
Right.
they got hung out to dry. A lot of them lost their jobs. They certainly lost hours, and they lost millions and millions of dollars worth of income. But the members of public sector unions were assiduously protected.
They were in
And,
lockstep, weren't they?
in some cases even rewarded. And I think you're going to have some of the labor people that generally support the NDP saying, wait a minute, there's discrimination here. There's actually discrimination, actually violation of the equality provision, Section 15 of the Charter, when the public sector unions were protected and the private sector workers weren't. So those are the kind of questions that you get people to testify under oath and say exactly what happened, why did it happen? You might be able to attach more
Exactly.
accountability then.
Now, there's another question that you raise within your document, and that is, of course, reflecting on our healthcare system. We know that our healthcare system is challenged, despite a lot of public assertions that we have an extraordinary healthcare system. I know we've got great people in it, but the facts are that we're rated consistently at the bottom of our OECD 32 countries ranking, and we have the second most expensive healthcare system in the world. So did COVID-19 frankly blow apart this mythology that we have a great healthcare system, and does it beg reform? Pardon the pun.
I think that's, if you had this commission, you have testimony from the medical people, and I agree with your first point. I think we have to give a lot of credit to the doctors and the nurses and the healthcare workers for what they did and what they put up with, and the protection that they provided to millions of Canadians. Nobody's denigrating that, or they should be denigrated. But what this thing has revealed is the system that
Exactly.
Canadian Medicare is inadequate. It has no surge capacity. It can't handle an increased load. In fact, one of the consequences of this is that the waiting lines for healthcare, the deaths on the waiting line, some think tank, I think it was just for the year of 2021, identified 11 million or 11,000 deaths on the waiting line because of deferred inability to get medical attention because of the dealing with the COVID crisis. So I think this is going to force looking at how do you reform the healthcare system. And I think what you're going to end up at is people are going to insist that you have one of these mixed systems, which most of the European countries, not the American system, mixed system. Everybody gets access.
Like Germany, France would be good examples.
Nobody's touching that you will get healthcare regardless of your ability to pay. Nobody's disputing that. But you have a mixed system with good public sectors, but you got room for not-for-profit healthcare deliverers, you got room for public-private partnerships, and you got room for private capital and privately operated facilities.
I think it was also fascinating how Canada was, in contrast with many other international jurisdictions that did not take our approach of kind of heavy lockdowns. And they did remarkably well, if not better than Canada, in terms of almost every measure, both economic, socially, as well as even mortality rates. I'm thinking of the obvious jurisdiction, and there's a number of them like them, and that would be Sweden. Why were we not able to have a kind of a, dare I say, a fulsome kind of public discussion, say, wow, we've done this for a year, maybe we need to switch horses because they're doing so much better than us?
Well, I think one could get at that through these impact assessments. If you, before you do it, you try to figure out what's the impact if we do it this way versus what's the impact if we do it that way. And of course, you look around the world to see who did what and who had the maximum effect in health protection, but the minimum effect on the economy. And outfits like, or countries like Sweden would come up in that. But the fact that we didn't do the impact assessments either on the impacts on rights and freedoms or the impact on the economy, we just seem to decide we're going to go that route.
Well, so maybe on that note, Preston, because we didn't do impact assessments, do you think, does that explain in part the answer why, frankly, so many health authorities have taken almost an authoritarian, almost a punitive approach to so many people? Like, I always point out the contradiction. You could go to Walmart, you could go to the liquor store, but you couldn't go to church, and you couldn't go to, say, your small business. But they would be fined. In fact, in Winnipeg, you've got the cases of churches like Springs Church getting fined. I mean, it's almost like they're after these people out of that approach of not looking at the impacts on people's lives in a holistic way.
That's when people talk about rights and freedoms, I actually tell them to actually go to what the charter itself says. Like we kind of have a vague idea.
You mean we should read the Charter of Rights and Freedoms?
Somebody said this is what it said. Well, go and look at it yourself. But on that question, there is a section 15 of the charter, that talks about equality rights. Every individual is equal before and under the law and has the right to equal protection and equal benefit of the law without discrimination, in particular without discrimination based on race, color, religion, and so forth. And so when you employ these heavy restrictive measures on a religious group, but you don't do it on a secular group, say, I've heard from churches that where they were shut down for having their religious services, but if they had an Alcoholics Anonymous or some social thing going on in the church, they would meet.
This
like,
is silly.
Well, this, and it's not equality; it's a violation of this section, and that's what these labor union guys point out. They say, how come if you're in a private sector union, you could lose your job, you could lose hours, you certainly lose income. If you were in a public sector union, under these same so-called protective measures, you were protected. That's not equality. And one of the conclusions I think this commission would come to is that these human rights tribunals that are established on every province, and there's a federal human rights tribunal, they are geared exclusively to defending equality rights. In their legislation, it's equality, equality,
Wow.
equality. And you didn't hear a peep.
Yeah, where were they? I guess they were closed too then.
Well, maybe I'm missing something, but we didn't hear a peep out of any of those commissions about these equality rights being violated.
Utterly bizarre.
Yeah.
Yeah, and so many incredible violations, as you say, the equality provisions. You've noted our friend, the Honorable Brian Peckford, is certainly one of the architects of the recent Charter of Rights and Freedoms, has stated many times, why did a premier not even refer this to the Supreme Court of Canada for reference, for an opinion, as they looked at all these drastic measures? Surely it crossed their minds that they needed to work together as a team and intelligently assess those violations.
Well, on that point, David, again, it doesn't hurt to read the charter. Like the first clause of the charter says, it doesn't say you can't limit rights. Like there's a provision there. It says the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms guarantees the rights and freedoms set out in it, subject only to such reasonable limits prescribed by law,
exactly,
as can be demonstrably justified in a free and democratic society. And if you read the whole thing, it says you can limit the rights, but here's what you got to do. One of it, you have to do it by law. Now, the lawyers will argue that a regulation is a law. Yeah, but a regulation proclaimed by a third-level bureaucrat is not the same as a law passed by the Parliament, of which I was a mention. What the federal government should have done, regardless of what the provinces did, is they should have put these limitations into a bill, into a law. We're going to limit your rights because we're trying to protect your health. Okay, that's fine. And put that to Parliament, let the Parliament debate it, and then refer it to the Supreme Court at the same time, like Harper did on the Senate thing. He had a bill in the House, but he referred it to the court. Can we do what we're trying to do? That's how this should have been handled if you want to do it by law. So you got to do it by law. And then it says you got to be able to demonstrate its justifiability in a free society. And if you read a little further, you got to be able to justify it in a court of competent jurisdiction. Those are three things. And I would argue that the federal government didn't do those things.
And so to be clear, the federal government has a pivotal role in protecting our Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, but they didn't even do that.
No, and you don't want to get into the family thing, but when this charter was put together, and I was around here, and I was in the consulting business, a whole bunch of us tried to get an economic property rights protection.
Yes, indeed.
Into the charter and failed at that. But Pierre Elliott Trudeau went ballistic when the provinces, particularly Alberta, insisted on this notwithstanding clause. They were trying to find some way of getting around the charter if it was being used to interfere in provincial jurisdiction.
Exactly, yeah.
But Pierre Elliott Trudeau went ballistic over that. And this is where he and Chrétien ended up in a fight. After it was all over, Trudeau was supposed to say to Chrétien, how did you ever allow that notwithstanding thing? Because it gives a way of getting around my charter. And Chrétien
said, it is truly gobsmacking. And I think it's also in the context then of democratic machinery. We have, of course, the various pillars of our democracy, the estates, if you will. We have parliaments or legislatures right across the country. We have the executive branch. We have the media. We have, of course, the courts. And yet, or even those associated machinery like these human rights tribunals. And I'm And I'm noticing a comment actually from the audience saying that they were with a law firm um, that did research on how human rights tribunals handled the COVID vaccine discrimination cases. But many of those complaints were brought forward and dismissed summarily and really not taken into account. So the punchline is this: on the estate of the courts, the judges have been kind of missing in action. Why is that?
Well, the actions were all taken at the lower court level. And again, I'm not a lawyer and expert on this, but I understand to actually get it to the Supreme Court, it's got to be appealed, and it's a very costly process to do
It
that.
is indeed.
And these ordinary folks that were that may have got into court over their infringement of their particular rights are not in a position to do that. I think eventually this is going to get to the Supreme Court, but the danger is it'll be long after the horse is out of the barn.
Exactly. And it's worthwhile noting that we'll be looking at having discussions with some of the leading legal leadership in our country around those kinds of actions that are going on now, potentially in the form of obviously class action lawsuits. So when we look at lockdowns, in summary, Preston, what would be your observation there in terms of their effectiveness? Were we really just hurting lots of innocent people, or were we really safeguarding the interests of society? I know that's a very big question, but any observations?
First of all, it's a question that should be, thoroughly investigated. Not just, my opinion, your opinion, someone's opinion, but on the surface, the effects of it's like if you're ill and they said we're going to shut your heart down for 6 months so we can look at what
Yeah.
whatever else is wrong with you, well, you'll be dead by then. And I don't think there's any circumstance under which you shut down your economy. It's the heart of your economic well-being. And I think if you ended up getting enough technical testimony from all the interest groups that were hurt by this and start to add up the cost and the economic damage that was done,
it's massive. Yeah, certainly the kind of reports that Frontiers looked at on so many fronts internationally has been the order of magnitude is easily 9 to 15 times the number of people died from COVID actually died from associated lockdown measures. It's really quite disturbing. Let's talk a little bit about the economy. Those lots of questions there in terms of how the management of COVID-19 also impacted our economy, right?
Well, yes, and mainly by jobs and incomes, and then there's these other unanticipated effects where people get used to not working, not coming into the office, not coming into the factory, and of course, a lot of these employers are finding that to get people back is not very easy, and you've got this sort of virtual labor shortage or real labor shortage, and some of the disruption of the markets apart from just incomes and jobs. Some of these other effects are momentous, and how are we going to adjust to them? How are we going to handle? That's another huge question. And one of it depends how, if this inquiry went far enough, if it was an official inquiry, you would get into this issue of should anybody be held legally and financially accountable for the damage that was done to others? Now, this will be a huge issue. I'm sure the lawyers will be licking their chops if it gets into litigating on that subject. But the country will almost have to decide, are you going to go after, from a legal and financial accountability standpoint, some of the people that were responsible for these damages? Or is that a subject where we're just going to say, look, we'll be into litigation for 15 years doing that? Should we just say, well, change the government, but let's move on? I don't think you can get too deep into that, or you'll be in it for years. Yeah,
you could end up being on an endless treadmill that would go kind of essentially nowhere, possibly, right? Are you concerned that the federal government essentially ran an operation without a budget for some 2 years?
Well, yeah, this is one of the differences between I was in the parliament from 1993 to 2001 or whatever it was. And we were at that time, the last budget of the Mulroney government was a $50 billion deficit, which in those days was considered monstrous, and particularly from a conservative government. And so we and a whole bunch of other people crusaded to balance the budget. And in those days, the Liberals, like in the 93 election, the Liberal Red Book had about 2 pages on financial stuff that they didn't see as a problem. But they didn't disagree that it was a problem. When we got into Parliament, we're hammering away on this. They say, yeah, we got to balance the budget, but you guys are going too fast, or you're doing it the wrong way. But they didn't disagree with the objective. Today, with this Trudeau administration, they don't seem to even acknowledge deficits and debt as a problem. They don't even acknowledge.
So there's this massive disconnect in terms of even the financial question, really.
Yeah. And so to answer your question, I don't think it bothers them. What kind of a deficit? They bought into this new monetary theory for a while, that as long as we're so-called excess capacity in your economy, you could print money ad infinitum. Of course, now it's proving to be inflationary, but there just isn't the concern there about deficits and debt that there used to be.
No, it is truly bizarre. Now, when you look also at kind of strategic issues, COVID-19, one of the answers that the government came forward was the importance of vaccines. If there was such a thing as a silver bullet, it was the vaccine will help us. And certainly the efficacy of that needs to be examined. Would you agree?
Yes, and I think there is a place for vaccines as part of the protection, obviously. And I got the 2 doses and the booster dose, and
Likewise.
Everything else. But I think where this started to get off the rails was in the communication of it. First of all, they said, if you get the vaccine, you won't get COVID. That was the street message that people got from the government.
Indeed.
Got it. Then that changed to say, well, there's a time limit to this sort of thing. So if you get one, you got to get another one, or maybe you got to get a booster. So now the efficacy is changing. And then at the beginning, they said there's nothing you can do from a pharmaceutical standpoint for drugs or anything to deal with the symptoms or to deal with COVID. In fact, they went very hard on any medical people that suggested there was some role for the pharmaceutical. And then that changed in Nature magazine, which is the Bible of the biological sciences. There was a huge article just a few weeks ago on the drug train
that's right,
used to try to deal with COVID. So I think the fact that the message on the efficacy of vaccines changed 3 or 4 times just gets the public not only confused, but skeptical. Do these people know what they're doing? Or if we believe that claim and it turned to be false, do we believe this claim? So that's another thing that could certainly be investigated. And one of the things I've said today, I'm a great supporter of the Canadian Science Policy Conference. It was started years ago, very small, and now it's a big operation. And they one of the things they try to do is get scientists together with political people to understand each other. But what I've been saying to a few of my science friends, I think the scientists have to do much more of the direct communication on this subject themselves. When their messages get filtered through the bureaucracy or through politicians or through the media, particularly the mass media, the science gets screwed up and misinterpreted. And in the future, again, I think one of the lessons come out of this is that there's got to be a lot more direct communication on these types of issues by the scientists themselves.
Well said. And that certainly raises, certainly in my mind, all kinds of related sub-issues, like the role of the World Health Organization. We know that all signatories have to follow supposedly a strict protocol. If there is a virus, they need to report it quickly. That certainly didn't happen with China. And of course, there's all kinds of questions related to the origins of the virus, namely the Wuhan lab. And I'm fascinated by this question. Almost it's a quasi-geopolitical question, is why Canada would go to source a vaccine of all places in China first, and then that fell through. Do you have any thoughts on that? Like, isn't that a strategic issue where Canada really needs to ensure that we work with our pharma industry to have that kind of domestic capability?
Well, I think this is an illustration where the politics gets mixed up with the science, and it's usually then whatever the issue is, it suffers from that mixture. I mean, Trudeau's been falling all over himself to prove that he's a friend and understander of China, and that morphed into this particular issue when it should not have, and it just again caused confusion and us not handling it as well as we should.
Exactly. One of the questions that has come up, speaking of vaccines, is one of the questions in the so-called 16 in your document, Preston, is that the government Canada needs to table and justify to table the information that was used to justify the emergency approval of the vaccines. This process and documentation is being withheld at this time by the government of Canada. When you think that would be an essential issue, given also questions regarding the harm that vaccines are having on some people.
Well, this, and it sounds like a broken record here, but this is again why you need an independent inquiry in which people can testify in front of it and testify under oath. The government can hide these documents, but there are people out there who know what's in them. And
Exactly.
not all of them are civil servants either. And if you had the proper forum where they could testify as to here's what we told them or here's what we didn't tell them,
That's right.
probably more of this information would
Yeah.
come out. But all of your questions, David, kind of, and I hear them from other people, they all beg this, we need to have an investigation as to how this was handled. And not just for the sake of blaming somebody, but for what you said at the beginning, for the lessons that can be learned from it, so
Yeah.
we don't make a mistake like this again.
Well, and I think further to that, Preston, would be, and I know that you allude to this in your document, is that this is a very important issue for the future of our society to rebuild trust. There's a lot of inconsistencies and I think very logical questions that have been asked that have not been answered. There's all kinds of documents that have been withheld. If we look at the federal government, we know that Blacklock's has revealed through a cabinet order the withholding at the federal level alone of 980,000 documents. This is a huge, I mean, this is incredible to imagine that. Those types of things, as long as that's the dynamic, it begs the issue, how do we strategically rebuild trust between these kinds of institutions and Canadians? Is that not a key imperative here?
Two major things you can say on that. One is that, and this would come out in inquiry, if you want to get support for a public policy, don't just rely on fear.
Indeed.
Now, there are consultants, backroom guys that consult to the political parties and governments, and they consult to the federal government that says, look, the quickest, cheapest way to get support for a public policy is to scare the hide off if your policy is not followed.
Right.
It's the cheapest, quickest way. And Ottawa bought into that. They've done that on the climate change file too. You scare the heck out of people. That's the way.
It's always a crisis.
Yeah,
it's a
but
crisis.
That's not a trust relation. A fear relationship is not a trust relationship. The other thing on public trust, and I've been involved in this because trying to get elected, you got to get people to trust you. If you don't trust people, if you don't demonstrate that you trust them, they won't trust you.
Exactly.
That's a very simple relationship. And when the government implies that you, the ordinary citizen, you don't know what's right for you, you don't know how to protect yourself, you don't even know how to do this social distance,
well said.
Put on your mask, you don't know what about let us tell you. What that says to the public, we don't trust you to do or say anything. And the government that says to people, we'll give you the information, here's what we think is the best choice, but there's several things you can do, and we'll leave it up to you to do it. That tends to engender trust. And this doesn't just apply to the COVID thing. I can just hear a lot of ordinary people saying, why should we trust them when
exactly
they trust us? And they're not just talking about one party, they're talking about the political establishment.
Well said. I want to turn gears a little bit to the rise of the truckers, a freedom movement that is really quite remarkable. And it continues to this day. I know I saw you in Calgary the other week, and it was really something because along St. Stephen's Avenue, as we were meeting, we heard literally thousands of people walk again down the streets of these cities. And that's happening right across the country. That movement has captured the imagination of a lot of people, not only in Canada, but around the world. To this day, thousands of them protest. Do you think they had an impact? And if so, how?
Well, I think they do. I've investigated this because one of the first questions that come up when you hear of these protests is, in particular if you're in the political business, is this legitimate? Like, is this some cooked up thing by some group to get attention on the national news? Or is
And
it?
was it legal,
Yes.
Preston? Was it legal?
Yes. And my conclusion is yes, this was legal and this was genuine. And all they were trying to do is protest the imposition of these vaccine mandates on these independent truckers. Well, our family has a small ranching operation. We use some independent truckers, not very much, a couple of them. And they come in the spring and take our cattle to a community pasture, and they come in the fall and take them to the processing plant. And I know a couple of these guys. For one thing, they got these $200,000, $300,000 rigs they pull into your yard. These things are usually financed to the hilt. If they miss 3 payments, they're probably in trouble. So these guys can't afford to be put out of work very long, or they lose their. And the idea that these fellows, there was someone from the Defense Department actually said to the government, apparently filed a memo with them, these people were out to overthrow the government of Canada. If I'm sitting in our yard with the trucker that's hauling these cows to community pasture, and you tried to convince me actually this guy's out to overthrow the government again, I'd say you're crazy. And yet this argument was made. So the point I'm making, I think it was a legitimate protest. They had a point. There was some wild and woolly elements to it, although even those I question, because you've got these smart consultants that these days it'll tell you if you're a government, there's 3 ways to handle a protest. One is to ignore it. The other is to mount a counter protest with your followers and supporters. The third way is to find some nutbars that will infiltrate it, or even will be paid.
Of course.
And will wave swastikas and hurl obscenities at the media and make sure they get in front of the camera. And if this COVID commission was ever set up, I think it would be worth investigating that possibility as to whether some of those negative elements weren't engineered by somebody else.
Exactly. Yeah. So in other words, just to clarify, so you're saying that the planting of these egregious symbols that we would all agree are offensive, like the Nazi swastika and the Confederate flag, were quite possibly planted.
It's a possibility, because, and what the police tell you is they'll watch the second or third day. Often, these guys will show up once. I mean, if they were a legitimate part of the thing, you'd think they'd be there the next day and the next day.
Well, and proudly identify themselves.
But often they're just there to get the shot on the camera. I don't know if that happened or not, but the bottom line is I do feel that the Freedom Convoy folks, the folks that organized it and supported it, are genuine and legitimate. And there's a lot of other groups now have taken heart from that and said maybe we should, expand this Freedom Convoy into something even bigger, a freedom movement. One interesting thing on that Freedom Convoy, one of the crowdfunding projects for it that I know a little bit about, that raised $12.7 million before they were told to give it back or frozen. But the treasurer for that asked me to guess from which province do you think the most money came from? And of course, I'm from Alberta, so I said, Alberta. No, he says the largest amount of money came from Quebec.
Isn't that fascinating?
The second largest amount of money came from Ontario. The third largest amount came from New Brunswick and Nova Scotia. The Western guys contributed more in kind than they did cash, the trucks, the fuel, but the money came. And I think one of the things that really alarmed the federal government, if they found that out, and that may even have triggered the Emergency Act, politically, they don't care if they lose votes in the West, they've lost them all anyway. But when they started seeing those Quebec truckers coming across into Ottawa, and if they had knowledge that that's where some of the support that is,
isn't that fascinating?
That's getting into their political base, and I'll bet that would have caused them to say we got to do something.
So just to put some tactical perspective on the truckers. So with this government, we have yet to see any medical justification or an order indicating why they created or went after them in terms of a vaccine mandate. These independent truckers that are, for for much of the day inside the cabs of their vehicles. They've been functioning successfully for years under this kind of regime. And all of a sudden, this order comes out of the blue that's almost tailored to go after them specifically. So what's your observation? Was this just kind of a cynical political wedge issue designed to go after them, or
I don't know what
what,
they're.
from a public policy point of view, what was going on?
I wonder how many people in the Privy Council office know what an independent trucker is. And it's not hard to find out. Just go outside of Ottawa, or I go outside of Calgary, go out to where there's a Tim Horton, a couple of fast food places. You'll see some big trucks with their engines still idling. And go, what do these guys do? They've got a cab. They've got a cab where they can sleep in it.
Yes.
These are not healthy guys.
It's often their home.
They're isolated. They talk about social distancing. They're social distancing by definition. The only time to get out,
hardworking people.
Yeah, and to feed themselves. Of all the groups that their lifestyle is least conducive to spreading a virus, it would be that bunch. I don't know why they picked on them. I don't know why.
Well, what's fascinating is that since those protests happened in Ottawa, and of course the blockades on a number of the border crossings or bridges, we've learned an awful lot. We learned that there was little foreign funding. There were certainly no guns among the peaceful protesters, or, to our knowledge, fires started in Ottawa. And we also learned, among other things, that the so-called evidence for the emergency powers came from CBC reports, of all things, that were not at all accurate. In fact, last night, according to, again, our friends at Blacklock's reporter, we learned another blockbuster, that the police, namely the RCMP, were never asked by the cabinet to invoke the Emergencies Act. This contradicts the repeated claims by the public safety minister that cabinet did so acting on the advice of law enforcement. Well, the Mounties said, no, this is not true. Quote, we're not in the position to provide influence on the government. Do you find that surprising?
Yeah, no, it's bizarre. And one of the complaints Westerners have too on when the truckers or supporters of the truckers blockaded the Ambassador Bridge at Windsor, there's a huge uproar in the media and from the federal government. This is a national disaster because you're interfering with this vital trade area. When protesters who were American-backed blocked the main CPR line, which carries 25% of our exports to the Pacific Rim, that not only did the government not declare that an emergency, the government appeared to side with the protesters. How come blocking a bridge in Ontario for 3 days is a national disaster requiring for emergency, and blocking a quarter of our exporting to the Pacific Rim in the West is not an emergency? Again, you just get contradictory signals.
Indeed, yeah. So the unequal basic application or commonsensical application of the law here begs a lot of serious questions. Like so many of these things, like if you look at these issues, it's almost like there's so many areas or decisions that were politicized instead of following kind of a semblance of knowledge or policy. Is that kind of a theme that you're concerned about here?
Yes, and at some point, like, one can have opinions on this and express this sort of thing, but there's got to be some formal inquiry in which there can be formal testimony that's made under oath. What actually was done, what were the impacts, and what, most importantly, what can be learned from this so that we never get into this situation again. And
exactly,
that inquiry has to be formalized. Otherwise, it's just going to be a subject of a sort of a national debate for forever, you know?
Well, indeed. And you have a considerable long experience in the life of our nation, Preston. Can you talk a little bit about your observations of leadership today? You've dealt with a lot of leaders over the years. You've seen them up close. What observations do you have about our leadership, and how do we frankly improve the quality of leadership being provided in our country?
I've almost got to the point, David, where I've said this to people individually, not to a crowd. I don't think this country has a prime minister. I think what we have is an amateur actor playing the role of prime minister,
Sorry, can you repeat that? We have an amateur actor.
playing the role of prime minister. I don't think we have a finance minister. We have a well-meaning journalist, and I know a little bit about you. You can get a degree in journalism from Carleton or Ryerson without taking a single course in economics or public finance. We have a
Or science.
yes, or science, but we have a journalist playing the role of finance minister, and this is we're getting into a virtual politics where the people in these positions aren't really the person, the leader in that person.
So that's a fascinating insight in the sense that you have these leading ministers who don't bring added value or background relative to that role.
They're not giving speeches anymore. They're reading scripts, is what they're reading. And my wife and I have talked about this. I mean, you can get very good at it. I mean, you can get to play the role. So by golly, it's believable. And we watch some of these medical shows like The Good Doctor and that. Now, these are actors and actresses, the ones that are playing the nurses and all that. And by golly, they're believable. They even show them doing operations and taking the kidney out and sitting on the shelf and everything else. You just say, by golly, that's a real doctor. But if you were sick, would you want one of those actors to be operating on you, or would you want the real thing, even if the real thing is not very handsome and is not very charismatic, but happens to know how you do medicine? And I think we're getting into a position where we right across the Western world, we don't so much have leaders as we have actors playing the role of leaders, and that's a serious development.
So how did that arrive in your estimation? Is it because we have a bureaucracy that is unusually strong, or it has been politicized, or do we have a dysfunctional set of communication going on with the media? How do we improve and elevate the level of thinking?
Those are all factors, but I go back to the political parties. I've been involved in candidate recruitment all my life. The first time I helped recruit a candidate was in the by-election in Alberta in 1968. But today you go and try and get competent people and honest people and qualified people to run for public office, and whether it's municipal, provincial, particularly federal, they won't do it. And the main reason they'll give you is say, I will not subject myself, and they usually mention their family. I will not submit myself and my family to the abuse that you get running for public office, particularly today through the social media. So this difficulty of recruiting competent people to run for public office is becoming acute, and it's augmented by the social media. Now on the hopeful side, like my father spent his entire life in public life. He knew R.B. Bennett. He dealt with 4 federal administrations: Mackenzie King, Louis Saint-Laurent, John Diefenbaker, and Lester Pearson,
Wow.
and a little bit of the front end of Trudeau when he's justice minister. But he said of all those administrations, the strongest one, and he didn't agree with it particularly, but the strongest, most capable one was Mackenzie King's war cabinet.
Interesting.
Because when the country gets into enough trouble, you can go to people that normally wouldn't touch public office with a 10-foot pole. King went to Louis Saint-Laurent, who was a top-notch lawyer in Montreal or wherever he was. At last thing he was thinking about was he went to C.D. Howe, a very good business guy, and made him the Minister of Munitions. And Howe went out. He bypassed the bureaucracy, both the Defense Department and the Public Works Department, and he buttonholed guys to run crown corporations that were outside the main system. And they say Howe would march into this guy's office, says, your country needs you to come and do this. And the guy said, oh, I'll come. Howe was an intimidating guy. And the guy would ask, how much are you going to pay me? Howe said, we're going to pay you $1 a year and you're going to come.
Wow.
And my father's point was that if you're getting enough soup, people that normally wouldn't touch your politics will touch it. And maybe, I'm trying to find silver lining to the COVID crisis, maybe something that violates a whole bunch of human rights, that makes a whole bunch of people sick, that strains the healthcare system, and that shuts down the economy. And maybe that's a big enough crisis for some of the people who normally wouldn't touch running for parliament or for a legislature, maybe to have second thoughts.
Indeed. That, to your point, that there would be enough leaders to recognize the trouble that our nation is in, to rise to this occasion and frankly renew.
Yeah, yeah. And to come back to that, what we talked about earlier about recognizing what's significant. When you got the parliament debating whether special rights should be given to recognition to people on the basis of race or culture or sexual orientation or whatever, that this is where their head is at. And you got your healthcare systems falling apart. You've got your economy locked down, and you've violated all the rights in your constitution. Are those people's head at what is really significant and significant to ordinary people?
Exactly.
I don't think so.
So on that note, Preston, I want to sum this up strategically with your help. We have an incredible nation. It's called Canada. And this pandemic crisis comes along. And our governmental response was far reaching and in many ways appears to have been, in too many cases, more political rather than policy based or even, dare I say, common sense. And as a result, that's exposed an awful lot of major issues, structural problems, including policy ones that we now will be forced to deal with. Is that what you're saying?
Yes, I think that's right. And then I'm repeating myself that there has to be some formal process for investigating this and arriving at the conclusions. And I think one of the conclusions that's going to come out of this, if it could ever be properly handled, there's the old joke about why the Canadian cross the road to get to the middle. But in this area of polarized things and extremes, sorry, just turn off my phone here. What's the balanced position? What's the balanced position between protecting health and protecting rights and freedoms under the Constitution? What's
Exactly.
the balanced position between protecting health and protecting the economic well-being of the economy? I think that's one of the lessons that could come out of this is what's the balance position, because we bounce between extremes of either coming down on like a ton of bricks on the health protection side or ignoring it. Where's the balance position?
Okay. So I think you said that very well. What is the balance? And the inquiry is a very important process, methodology to figure out that balance. And if we don't do this, there is a risk, is there not, Preston, in the sense that Canada becomes increasingly more dysfunctional. I don't want to say this in some kind of dramatic fashion, but there's a risk that Canada becomes a failed state, is there not?
Yes, and that the declining respect that people see that we didn't handle these things well. We don't well, and so respect for your country, respect for your leadership decline. So there's a lot of work to be done in this area, and I'm just hoping the country gets at it and just. The government desperately wants to, again, the political guys say, change the channel, change the channel. When this Russian attack on the Ukraine came along, I bet there was almost a celebration in the PMO saying, this will change the channel, let's get off.
Indeed. Yeah, exactly.
Thing. And even the Liberal NDP coalition thing was a change the channel, change the channel. But there's still this, what's on this channel now still has to be dealt with. And I don't think just changing the channel will allow the country or the government to get away with it.
Indeed. I'd like now to, as we kind of wrap things up, turn a little bit to the whole area of action and hope, and your advice on that score. What do you think we should be urging our government to do? What can we as citizens do?
Well, I would start, David, by not asking what should the government do, but asking viewers, what can you do? That it starts with what can we do? That this business of looking to the government as the solution to everything is partly what's got us into this trouble. So I wrote this book called Do Something, 365 Ways to Strengthen Democracy. Some people suggest it might be better to have just 3 good ideas. but on this particular thing, the first thing I would say to people, and people that are watching this or considering it, is tell your own story. Write down your own story. How did this COVID thing and how it was handled affect you? like it protected your health. Maybe some of these things did protect your health. We'll give them credit for doing that. But how did it affect your exercise of your rights and freedoms, your freedom of belief, your freedom of assembly, your freedom of speech, your equality freedom? And how did it affect you economically? And write that story down, or be able to tell. And then that's the first thing. Write your own story as what this meant to you. And then the second thing is share it. Share it with your family, share it with your younger people, but share it, and then share it with your elected person. Share it with your MLA, your MPP, your MNA, and your MP. So that's figure out your story, share it with those people, and then demand something, or ask is the more polite way to ask for this inquiry. Ask your MP, ask your MLA, can you work towards getting this inquiry? Ask around, can we figure out some non-governmental person who could be a commissioner? That's a big unknown question yet, and could be asked. But ask for this inquiry and think about this inquiry. And then fourthly, or fifthly, keep an eye out for these various groups that are trying to do something in this area. These people that are supporting the freedom thing, these people that are supporting the ending the lockdown and all the measures connected with it sooner rather than later. Find out one of those groups near you. They're not hard to find, and join one and give them money if you can. So this is not, getting Ottawa to do something right away, but it's just to know your story, tell your story, share it with elected people, demand full-blown investigation into it, and join one of the groups that's advocating for this. That would start, that's what these bottom-up populist things are about. And I know people get discouraged on this, but I can share my little story. A number of years ago, 5 of us met in a boardroom here in Calgary. We didn't like any of the political options. We didn't like the existing party. So and I was in favor of, why don't we start a new party? The West's got a great history of doing that. The other fellows weren't sure that was the thing to do. So we couldn't even agree on that. So we did agree to say, let's have a conference to decide what our options are. Do we start a third party in the Western tradition? Do we start a new interest group? Do we start a communications vehicle? Do we try to work within the existing party? Let's have a conference and decide. Well, they had the conference, and the idea of a new party did come out of it. The party got 52 seats in the 93 election, became opposition in 1960. We morphed it into another thing by joining with the Klein Conservatives in Alberta and the Filming Conservatives in Manitoba and Mike Harris's gang in Ontario. And then that thing, Stephen Harper and Peter MacKay put it together one more time. He got the Conservative Party of Canada and got a minority government, and then he got a majority government. No.
Wow.
Whether you agree with what any of those governments or parties did, my point is that the democratic process, with all its flaws, and I've been a critic of it in Canada, gives you the opportunity to do that, to try to persuade people to do this or that, to exercise their vote this way. And in that case, it ended up in a majority government. And so these same tools can be used to accomplish some major things. And I hope people will exercise them with respect to expanding this Freedom Convoy concept and getting a full-blown inquiry into the management of the COVID crisis.
Well, that wraps things up. That's a very inspiring summary, Preston Manning. And for someone who's retired, you continue to inspire us with your leadership and work. And on behalf of all of us today at Frontier and all our participants, I just want to thank you so much for your leadership and work on this critical issue.
Okay, well, thank you very much, David, and thank you to Frontier.
Well, at the Frontier, this important conversation will continue as we attempt to learn from this moment in our nation's history. We'd love to hear from you, and be sure to read Mr. Manning's story and reflection on our website that is posted, among other resources, including the briefing note by one of our colleagues, David Redman, on a briefing note to premiers, a post-COVID recovery plan on our website. So be sure to read that as well. We welcome your feedback, and please contact us if you think an inquiry is important. And stay tuned for additional discussions and analysis on this topic, including today's commentary on Frontier by our colleague, Judge Brian Giesbrecht. Be sure to read it. And thank you to all of you, friends of Frontier, who joined us today and for your comments and participation. Be sure to join us for our next Leaders or Policy on the Frontier. We also want to thank all of you who donate and support the Frontier. Frontier is nonpartisan and we do not accept any government funding. Your support makes it happen, so thank you. And that's it for today. My name is David Leese, and remember, without open discussion and debate, you are not thinking, and nor are you free. So keep asking good questions and do not be afraid. And on behalf of all of us at Frontier, thank you for joining us.